The Bible in the 21st century. In this presentation we're going to look at the topic of slavery in the modern world. What does the Bible have to teach about slavery? We'll start by looking at the biblical principles and then looking at what's happening in our world today and what we can do about it. Slavery has always been a problem. If you look back in history, slavery developed in almost all early cultures. And it was important in the cultures in the Old Testament era. While in the New Testament days, the Roman Empire was just simply built on slave labour. Later it became a major feature of Islamic society. And then it grew again as European countries exploited the New World. But as that happened, there were strong moves from some Christians against the slavery. It took a long time to stop it, but it was finally banned in the UK the beginning of the 19th century, banned in the UK overseas territory shortly afterwards, and then later outlawed in the United States. But it continued on in the Islamic world. The UK and France got together and they exerted pressure on the Islamic world to stop slavery, and it was finally rejected in the mid-20th century. Sadly, slavery has re-emerged in new forms today. That's probably an underestimate, but that's what we know for certainty. 30 million people. Now we've got to watch words in the Bible. If you go into the Old Testament, the Hebrew word is abject, and it's used a lot of times. But it can have a wide variety of meaning. Anything from domestic servant right up to total slavery. Only the context will make it clear how the word is being used. Modern translations, genuinely modern translations, help us considerably here. But we've got to be careful. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek, two words in the Greek were used. These two words covered the main uses of the word abed in the Hebrew. Now that word simply means a child, a boy, or a servant. Because in fact in the cultures of that time, children often just simply served their parents. There was no education, and survival in an agricultural life depended on having labour. So there's nothing untoward about that at all. But there was genuine slavery. But the extent of slavery was very variable. Some slaves in the Roman Empire carried enormous power in a household. They virtually ran the household for their master or mistress. Right across to slaveries who were treated abjectly. There's another New Testament word which is quite common, and this is the radical idea that the New Testament brings in. The idea of voluntarily serving other people. Simply because there's a need, we try to help. That completely is countercultural in the biblical days. So we've got everything in the New Testament from enforced slavery right across to a free servant, where we simply serve others because we see a need. That's the New Testament pattern. Overall, when you see the word slave or servant or related words, just watch, be careful, care in interpreting language, because the English words don't necessarily have the exact meaning of the original words in the Hebrew or the Greek. And again, a genuinely modern translation will help us here considerably. Now, slavery was all around in the Old Testament times. If there was warfare and you took prisoners of war, they just became your slaves. People were just born into slavery. Their parents were slaves, they were slaves too. Some people went into slavery because they'd hit hard times, they had to borrow, and debt repayment, they put them into slavery to someone who'd lent them the money. They often never escaped from that. There were no legal restrictions in the law codes of the cultures in New Testament eras on how long a slave could serve. Very often they just died in slavery, and they rarely lived to old age. However, the laws of Hammurabi do limit debt-type slavery. It's not to go on forever. But most of the cultures of the time had no limits. And if you were released, no compensation or provision. The owner could do exactly what they liked with you as a slave. The only limitation was that if you damaged the slave too much, they wouldn't be able to work too well. But there were no legal restrictions in the cultures round about the land of Israel. Sick slaves couldn't work, so they're often just left to die. And if you ran away and you were caught and brought back, usually you suffered the death penalty along with any members of your family that were there too. It was a grim existence. In the New Testament times, the Roman Empire was simply organized on the basis of slave power. It wouldn't have survived without it. And they had no rights. It's entirely at the discretion of the owner. People were just simply bought and sold in slave markets. Sometimes they held high positions of responsibility and freedom. Sometimes they were in abject slavery, worked into the ground. Now, you could purchase your freedom, but how could you raise the money? Almost impossible. And you didn't have any rights as full members of society. It was very definitely an underclass. There was no control over the physical abuse, and sometimes one slave would be tortured in front of the others simply to intimidate them to total obedience. You could mutilate slaves if you wished. You could do what you like. And female slaves that were caught often just became sex possessions of their owner. Left to die. And the same thing happened here. Death penalty, often with members of the family. Now, how does that relate to the biblical text? Because the biblical text was written and developed in the context of the cultures of the Old Testament period and the New Testament period. And we must interpret it in that way. What does it actually say? If you look at the Bible overall, the writers accepted the existence of slavery. They knew no alternative. There was no other social structure in the societies round about, and they had no power to change these. But particularly in the Old Testament period, the people of Israel were acutely aware that they had once been slaves. They were slaves in Egypt before God rescued them. And they didn't want to put others through that experience. And that's why in the Old Testament there are great restrictions on the nature and extent of slavery. We'll look at these in a moment. But the New Testament takes us forward further to a society of total equality, all one in Christ Jesus, as Paul put it. There were no distinctions, and the slave and the free was part of that equality. Now that is utterly radical in the cultures of the day. Let's just stop for a moment and think about how we approach the Bible. What does it actually say? Remember, it's in translation. Use a genuinely modern translation. The translators with great skill have tried to capture the meaning of the original text and get it into modern English, or whatever language you use. But ask, when you read something, to whom was it originally addressed and what's the context? How would the original hearers have got it? And why was it said? Then that just opens the door to reveal the underlying principles. And then we have to interpret it into today's cultural context. The warning is this: don't rip verses out of context. That's too dangerous. We've got to recognize the cultures of the biblical day were very different. The biblical text was written in the context of these cultures. Our culture is different. But there's an ultimate ethical principle that the biblical text points to that applies in every and any culture. So we ask, what's the text saying to the culture of the biblical era? And then what does it mean for today? But always look to see what's it pointing to, because the biblical text is always pointing to the best way of living. God made us. God knows the best way for us to live. He's not a killjoy. He wants life to be rich, full and free. And the biblical text points to that better way and then to the best way. That's how we can make sense of the biblical text. We'll return to that in a moment or two to illustrate some of the dangers. Now, just looking at this in an overall sense, the Bible is set in terms of stories of events, people, places, and real life, and it presents it warts and all. It recognizes the frailties and weaknesses of you and me. And we are taken through things at a pace with which we can cope. And we've got to see how the original hearers would have got it. It works within a culture, and it points to God's long-term goals for humanity. And it's encouraging us all to share the love of God for all those around. Now, the word love is not a word of emotion. In the biblical language, it's a word of action. We seek the best for others, no matter what the cost is to ourselves. That's what the Bible is pointing us to, and that's got clear relevance when it comes to slavery. But it's got to be written in the language and cultural thought forms of the day, because that's when it was said and written down. And it's trying to take the original hearers from where they were to a better position. And it sets out the principles which apply for us today. That gives us a good guidance as to how we can interpret it. Now let me illustrate this with some biblical texts. Slaves are allowed days off on the Sabbath. Right back in Exodus. Notice, so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you, who may be a slave or a servant, remember the word slave could mean servant, may be refreshed. No other law code or society had a provision like that. In Deuteronomy, speaks about slaves or servants, the same word, remember, in worship. They are rejoiced before the Lord your God, you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, but that's the same word as slaves. The Levites from your towns who have no allotment or inheritance of their own. No other society or culture had that provision for those who were slaves or servants. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. Now that's unique. No other culture has that. But when they're released, but this applies to all slaves or servants, when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Now that's completely and utterly radical. It runs right against the cultural norms of the day. And there are limitations in physical beatings. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And if an owner who knocks out the tooth of a slave or female slave must let the servant go free to compensate for the tooth. Now, it might be accidental or it might be deliberate. It doesn't specify. But in the cultures of the time, right through to the Roman Empire, you could do what you liked to slaves, right up to killing them with no redress. This is very, very different. You can see how the Bible takes us forward, but we've got to interpret it in terms of the culture of the day. Just one reference in the New Testament. Masters, provide your slaves, and that's the genuine word slaves in the Greek, with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. It accepts that slavery may be there. People came to follow Jesus who owned slaves. What were they to do with them? There's Paul's instruction. Treat them rightly and fairly. Don't exploit them. There's no way the followers of Jesus could simply demolish slavery across the Roman Empire. It was part of the culture. But they could treat slaves with respect. That's radical. Going back to the Old Testament. If someone is caught kidnapping a fellow Israelite and treating or selling them as a slave, again the word slave could be a servant, so it's at any level, the kidnapper must die. Now there's no evidence that instruction was ever carried out, but what it does show is God doesn't want this to happen. Don't do it. Treat people with respect. You don't sell people on. You don't exploit others as possessions. That runs completely against the culture or the social norms of the day. And if someone runs away from somewhere else, don't send them back. If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them. That's got great messages today, where sometimes we send people back when they've fled from countries where they've been brutally treated, and we send them back to a terrible life, perhaps even death. These are radical things. You see, if you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, but I focus more on the Old here, there's a quite massive improvement in the conditions for slaves compared to all the contemporary societies and law codes that existed at the time, and we possess these. That's what the biblical idea and the biblical text is taking us to. It's taking us forward. It can't remove slavery. The people of Israel and the followers of Jesus later, they couldn't abolish slavery. They didn't have the power. But they could limit it to treat people with respect. You could summarize it this way. God takes us gently from where we are to a better position, and he does it with skill. He knows the reality of our situation. He knows that the world around is fallen. There's so much evil around, but he's pointing us always forward to a better way of living. Treat others with respect. That's a reflection of the love of God. But God reveals these things in the biblical text in ways that make sense to the original hearers. Now, we have to remember that we're living several thousand years later. And we've got to interpret it in terms of the context. You see, God is moving us towards his ideal, his best way. But it's got to be done within the realism of what's possible in a fallen world. Let's go back, as I said we would, to the Bible. If you take the Bible literalistically, then you've got to believe in a flat earth. In the biblical days, that's how the world was seen. It was flat. It's obvious. You look around, it's flat. There was a dome above it. It's obvious there's a blue dome above it. We call it the sky. And the sun and moon move across that in patterns which they'd studied. They thought of the flat earth being built on pillars over water. That's obvious, because there are springs of water that come up from underneath. Now, we know that's not the correct picture. You don't take the Bible literalistically. Otherwise, you have to believe in a flat earth. It's a cultural thing. And if you look at the Bible in terms of the way societies operated, they had no concept of democracy anywhere. Monarchy, emperors, dictatorship, that was the norm. Now, if you take the Bible literalistically, we've got to move our societies back to that kind of rule. Basically, dictatorship, which may be benign or it may be harsh. No one in their right minds would do that. No, you must interpret these things in terms of the context. In the biblical days, societies were almost entirely patriarchal. Women were second-class citizens. We may despair at that, we may reject that, but it happens to be the historical fact. And the Bible assumes that. It has no option of matriarchal societies or egalitarian societies. That's why the instructions of the Bible are so radical. They cut right across the cultures. But they do it step by step as we're able to cope. Till Paul eventually can say, all one in Christ. And the male and female hierarchy vanishes to equality. Don't take it literalistically. No cultures anywhere around consider the abolition of slavery. We've got to interpret the Bible in the context of the way societies operated. Now that illustrates the dangers of taking texts ripped out of context literalistically and applying them today. We must look at it in context and what it would mean for the original hearers. And slavery is part of that. Now let's move forward into a few biblical texts. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so that they can continue to live among you. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to give you land of Canaan and to be your God. They remembered they'd been slaves. To help each other, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you. They've had a bad harvest or two. They've lost everything. Maybe illness has struck them. The instruction is, do not make them work as slaves. Treat them as hired workers, temporary residents. to work to you until the year of Jubilee. Every 50th year, everyone resumed their total property rights of 50 years before. That's a wonderful idea. It stops the wealth accumulating in the hands of minorities while the majorities lose out. Then they and their children are to be released. They will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves, but remember the word slave could mean servant. You can get domestic servants, but you don't exploit them. You may also buy some with a temporary residence living among you and members of your clans born in your country. They'll become your property. Treat them with respect. They remembered their background. The wonderful picture. But treat people with respect. They've had hard times. Help them out, don't exploit them. Release them after a given time. Don't sell them on. You can take from other nations, but that just may be servants. This moved things forward enormously. If you buy a Hebrew servant, same word, could be slave, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. If he has a wife, when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons and daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master. Only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and don't want to go free, now that speaks that they've been well treated. Then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door of the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. That's like ear piercing for you ladies. Then he'll be his servant for life. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, oh, how this has been ripped out of context by biblical critics. She is not to go free as male servants do. But if she does not please the master who selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed, bought back. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he's broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these 3 things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Now that has been grossly misunderstood, and some parts of it are not easy. But going back to the beginning bit, fixed time limit. The word there is the word for a maidservant, female slave, maid or handmaid. It's not the word that we mentioned before. It's a much rarer word. And essentially what happens here is that a man gives his daughter to be a servant to another family. Of course, the man of the family accepts it and has to pay. It's like a dowry, if you like. Now, it could be that the daughter marries the man in due time, or it could be that the daughter is given to the son of the man into whose house she's been sold. She's a maidservant, but she must be treated with respect, not pushed around, not exploited. It must be interpreted in terms of the context of the cultural pattern of the day. In the original, it just says her. Is it the son marrying another woman or the father? We can't be sure. And we don't really understand what that phrase actually means. Translated here as marital rights, it's more likely to mean ointments. In other words, she's got to be provided with the things that give her quality of living. whatever the details are of this and however it's to be interpreted, the principle is clear. She is to be treated with respect, not as property. That's radically different. If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. But when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing hold, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. He rescued you. He bought you out. That's why I give you this command today. It's a strong element throughout the Old Testament. The people were acutely aware of where they'd come from, what they'd been through, or their ancestors had been through. And that was the basis of them treating each other with complete respect and not exploiting others who'd hit hard times. There is no equivalent in any culture anywhere at that time, or indeed for centuries later. They knew what they'd come from. They didn't want to put other people through it. But when we look at the Old Testament, remember the word, which is translated differently in different versions. It's a word that can encompass almost everything from service to abject subjection. Just be cautious. All these people are described as slaves of God. Servants, sometimes that's the translation. Foreigners who joined the people of Israel. To be as servants, it's the same word, it could be slaves. David, described as God's servant, the word is the same word, it could be slave. We have to be careful. Jesus himself is described with the same word, my servant. It's the same word, could be slave. Because the word encompasses all kinds of meaning. From willing service right across to abject exploitation. The context tells us, and genuinely modern translations help us. Slavery was there throughout the whole period. If I summarize it, remember the word covers a wide range of meaning. It was a social norm, and the biblical text takes us forward enormously. It lifts any concept of slavery away from unconditional subjection of one person to another. That's a big breakthrough, but it's not the end story. There are more Greek words, therefore we can slightly more precise. But we've got to remember the culture was built upon slavery, and that involved exploitation. The New Testament breaks away from that, and it points to a reality of total equality. We're not even there yet, but that's the goal that God has in mind. That's what his ideal is. That's what he wants. It doesn't deal with, is it right or wrong? It couldn't. The people at the time knew no other way. But it takes the norm of its day and it points it forward to a better way. And it gives guidance, practical guidance, to improve things. Let's interpret the Bible in that way. Now to the modern world. How do we apply this today? The tragedy of modern day slavery. People being forced to work without adequate pay, and without adequate pay is treating it rather generously, often under the threat of violence, and they're unable to leave it. They can't break out. Modern slavery is all around us. People exploited agriculturally in factories, mining, all kinds of outdoor manual work. The classic one is brick making, indoor service work, slaves in a home, right across to brothels, where the money is made by those who run them at the exploitation of the girls. And indeed in private homes there can be slaves. I'm going to divide this into three broad categories. Slavery that's labour slavery, sexual slavery or child slavery. If we look at the top 10 countries, and I'm doing it by numbers, and we'll look at the percentages of the population, this is where it's worst in the world today. Now this data was gathered a few years ago. It's probably an underestimate. Not a good picture. This is an awful lot of people being exploited by others. Now known as Myanmar. Now the 30 million is probably an underestimate. It's based on figures which can be got with certainty. The top 10 account to 22.6 million of that 30. And the data is just a few years old. But we've no reason to believe that it's radically different today. Let me just take three examples from one country. People are forced into debt. Then they become the possession of the employers. In this country there are 1.7 million such people, and these people end up being exploited. They're in penury and hopelessness. They work excessively long days. Their children have to work as well. There's no education. Sexual slavery, street boys, so many of them end up in drug addiction, and a sizable minority end up with AIDS. I put down the figure 1,000 per year because that is with certainty. Some people who've studied this think that it's considerably more. But 1,000 per year means roughly 3 every day. Teenage girls. They get no redress under the law, because Sharia law trumps the protection of these girls. Roughly 2/3 of them are teenage girls of Christian families. It's one powerful way to keep other religions down. These are just examples. The tragedy is the slavery is all around us. And it exists in the West as well, where people are being traded, exploited, promised all sorts of things, and they end up working in a brothel somewhere. That is a certain figure. It's probably more. People in debt from poverty become the possession of somebody else and are then just worked to death. Girls are forced into marriage, often at ridiculously young ages, and humans are trafficked. "75% is from the 10 countries I've shown as at 2014. If we look at the Middle East, for example, they've got a kafala system where foreigners come in to work on building sites, for example. The employers take away their passports. They then work long days in high temperatures, often with inadequate food and water, and they can't escape because they've got no passport. And the trading industry, where people are moved around, bought and sold. People do it for money. Of the 30 million, 23 is just exploiting people to get work for free. A lot of it's sex slavery. Women and girls suffer slightly worse, but young people are greatly abused. And we've got to watch in the West that things that we buy and use, such as our clothes, we've got to be careful that these have not been made in sweatshops where particularly women and girls are being exploited brutally in order that we can have cheap clothes. We've got to be responsible. That's maybe the question you ask. What can we do? And we maybe shudder at that thought. But we've got to remember, in the West, we are wealthy at levels that people in most parts of the world could never even dream of. We've got to address the poverty issues that allow people to end up in slavery. We have so much we can help. We've got to bring about meaningful school education, not exporting Western education, but education that's meaningful so that they're equipped for life, to understand, they're equipped to work, to do jobs, to have the skills they need to take their society forward, to earn a living. We need to support families, honour families, but help families that don't end up with so many children that they're in poverty. We don't breed for poverty, but the answer is not abortion, which in the West we're tending to export. That's not the way forward. We need to provide the support and safe houses for people who've been rescued from such dreadful slavery. It may take years for them to recover and be restored. But that's the greatest thing. The message of hope in Jesus. Jesus treated all people equally. He mixed with the social outcasts of his day, the bottom of the social heap. He treated people with respect. And the New Testament pictures us moving to a position where all are of equal and of infinite value in God's eyes. There are wonderful agencies throughout the world that work on the ground with responsibility. Let us channel our resources through them to help those who are suffering, who are being exploited. That's what we can do in practical terms. But it's encouragement for us. Slave to sin, Jesus sets free. Obedient slaves, you are a slave to the one that you have to obey. Slavery to sin, that points to something better. The strange paradox where slavery is freedom. Jesus made himself nothing but taking the very nature of his servant, a slave. If anyone was free, he was free. serving the Lord. Slavery is freedom. Same word. The kingdom of God. It's peace, joy in the Spirit, because anyone who serves Christ in this way is pleasing to God. Same word. Slavery is freedom. When we put our heart and soul and commit ourselves to serve Jesus. And that's freedom. He sets us free from the slavery. And the slavery to him is total freedom. What a beautiful and wonderful picture. The idea of slavery. Be careful about language. We are all made in the image and likeness of God. Exploiting others at all in any way, it's not what God wants. The biblical pattern is he accepted what was in society and tried to move it forward. And this amazing idea of being a slave, a willing slave to Jesus to serve him. And serving each other. Some Christians led the way. Indeed, we probably have slavery in the world everywhere today if it hadn't been for their wonderful work of the past. But it's still there. It's hidden very often. For labour or sex. And what we can do is support organisations, put our hands in our pockets, many doing wonderful, remarkable work all over the world. But think about ourselves, serving Jesus, where our agenda is what he wants, in total obedience, because slavery, his perfect slavery, is freedom. Slavery in the modern world that's the central biblical picture. Let us treat each other with total respect.